You're about to listen to the English version of this episode. If you prefer to listen to the Spanish one, just click on the link in the show notes. Estás a punto de escuchar la versión en inglés de este capítulo. Si lo prefieres, tienes el link a la versión doblada en las notas del capítulo. So yeah, here I am, speaking English again. This first interview of the season is very, very special. It's not every day that you get a chance to chat with one of your favorite authors, especially when that author is foreign and has sold over 1 million books. My guest in this episode is Austin Kleon, the author of a fantastic trilogy on creativity, which started with Still Like an Artist, continued with Show Your Work, and concluded, at least for now, with Keep Going. All three are small square format books that blend text and illustration. Austin describes himself as a writer who draws. These are books that can be read in just over half an hour, but I think they are worth revisiting multiple times. They are packed with nuggets of wisdom on how to find your own style, develop creative habits, expose yourself to criticism, or persevere when things get tough. Moreover, many of these ideas go far beyond the world of creativity. They are useful for life in general. But Austin isn't just a great author, something I already knew. He's also a delightful person. He's kind, accommodating, and a very good conversationalist. We talked, of course, about creativity, but also about parenting, Don Quixote, video games, and even how to visit museums. I thoroughly enjoyed our chat, and I think it shows. Now, I hope you also enjoy this conversation with Austin Kleon. I am Jaime Rodríguez de Santiago, and this is Kaizen, the podcast where I bring you fascinating people, ideas, and techniques to understand the world a little bit better every day. Austin, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to chat with you. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for joining me on the podcast today. I've been a long time fan of your work, and I have mentioned it in several episodes. And when Monica, my editor, told me that they were republishing Still Like an Artist in Spain, which I have here as Roba como un artista, I jumped on the opportunity to try and chat with you. Just out of curiosity, have you ever been to Spain?
I've never been to Spain, but this summer I read Don Quixote for the first time. And so I felt like that was going to ancient Spain. So
did you enjoy it?
I loved it. I just turned 40, and I feel like Don Quixote is a midlife crisis book. And so it spoke to me very deeply. And particularly, I take bike rides with my neighbor who is 75.
Okay.
And we're arguing. He's very much Don Quixote, and I'm very much Sancho. I feel so sometimes. So it's fun. I've always wanted to go to Spain, but I just haven't been yet. But I'll get there.
You should. I'm sure you'd enjoy not only the literature but also the painting history in Spain. It's so rich, and I think Don Quixote is such a fascinating character. That amount of creativity and idealism, and at the same time, even social critique coming from I think it's 16th century, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's really fun. I really recommend anyone who hasn't read it to read it. But you have to be in the right. It's just like any other book. I really believe that a book is an experience. You know, the writer puts the words on the page, but the reader has to be ready to receive them. And so, you know, there are so many books out there that it just has to be the right time for them. Yeah. You know, a book that might not be for you when you're 20 will end up being a book for you when you're 40, you know, or 50 or 60 or whatever. Yeah. So, right book, the right time for me, Don Quixote.
And you know, I think both the writer and the reader change over time. It's been just over 10 years since Still Like an Artist was first published, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. And I've heard you reflect on how you wrote it from the perspective of your, I believe, 29-year-old self, and that you would not be able to approach it the same way now. How would this book be different if you wrote it today? What has changed the most in the way you think in these years?
Well, I think it's really me that's changed the most. Okay. I think one of the gifts of getting older is that things become more complex. Issues become more complex. You see more depth. You see more, gray area between black and white. Steal Like an Artist is a very, I always feel like it's a very punk book. It's very punky in that it's very, I always wanted it to feel like a record by like the Ramones or Wire or one of those great punk bands that just came in quick and fast and really came at you. So there's a youthful energy in Steel that I don't have anymore. So that's one thing. So I've changed, but then the world has changed too, in that Steel Like an Artist has really become this very, it's in the world. It's very much how we operate now. And even when I wrote the afterword for Steel Like an Artist, AI still wasn't like kind of the thing it is now. Even when I wrote that was like 2 years ago. I think it was 2 Junes ago that I wrote that. And so, things change so quickly. But the one thing that the one thing I think is cool about Steel Like an Artist is that it is rooted in very old ideas. And so I think one of the reasons, and this is paradoxical, is I think one of the reasons it's had the life it's had is because it's so rooted in these old ideas. And one of the oldest idea is there's nothing new under the sun. Everything's been said, that kind of thing. That's a very ancient concept, this idea that humans have gone as far as they're going to go. And so it doesn't matter what generation it is, we'll always have that feeling that like, oh, I got here too late or everything's been done. And, that's kind of an ancient idea, actually.
No, I fully agree with. You can perceive the energy in the book in the sense. I always say that it's like a slap in the face.
Yeah.
In the sense of a wake up slap. That's waking you up to those ancient ideas that most of us either knew or maybe had an intuition for, but they were never as explicitly clear as they are in the book. And I fully agree that makes it. To remain current, even in the age of AI, which I believe there can be a lot of criticism, but at the end, the core of Still like an Artist, you can be applied to creating with AI. I don't know where you stand on AI, because it's obviously there's a lot of, as you said, it's a complex issue, right? There are a lot of nuances and things to consider when it comes to where the inspiration comes from and whether it's inspiration or blatant copies. But I think the technology itself could be used in that sense.
Yeah, I think where I am with AI is that the computer is very good at giving you what has come before. And so it's very easy to say, show us Star Wars, but directed by Wes Anderson. That's actually very easy. The computer can say, oh, okay, I just average out these things and whatever. What's really hard is these kind of creative leaps where we kind of see something that we haven't seen before. And a lot of that kind of creative insight from the human perspective comes from doing what an AI does, bombing our brains with all of this information and swallowing up as much as we can. But then there's something very mysterious that happens in the kind of depths of our heads. And it's also very contextual. We have bodies that are in the world. And if you read about some of the great artists or some of the great bands or people who use their bodies in their work, there's something that happens that they don't know that it's happening, right? There's something kind of mysterious. And so AI doesn't have that. The computer doesn't have that kind of mystery. It doesn't have a body. It doesn't know what it's like to be in the world. It doesn't know what it's like to be in a room with people. It doesn't know what it's like to have an audience or to have a soul or anything like that. So for me, it's like, it's going to be interesting to see where things end up. My one take on AI is, or maybe my fifth take on AI at this point. The one thing I'll say about AI is that I think that things have gotten so mediocre overall, just so averaged out and bland, that there's a generation that's more in the position to accept AI generated works. because they've grown up watching things that were CGI'd. They've grown up watching, superhero movies that all look the same. And so there is this kind of sense that everything's like averaging out and it's very mediocre and it's made for, but that is why now I feel like I'm kind of transitioning into a curious elder in that I'm becoming an older person in the culture. And what I'm looking for now is stuff that feels really fresh to me, stuff that doesn't feel like an AI created it. And in the United States, I don't know if this show is, it's probably not popular in Spain, but there's a show called Somebody Somewhere. And I don't know how that translates, but it's so human. And whenever I watch that show, I think a computer could never come up with this because it just has such a soul to it. And it's so simple and it's so straightforward. And so I think now if I was writing a book like Steal Like an Artist, I would say, try to go as deep and as weird as you can be as a human to try to come up with something that the computer could never come up with. Yeah. And I think that's our job as humans. And I do think that in some ways, AI might be a great gift to us because we might stop piddling around with the stuff that the computer can do, and maybe we can leap forward. I don't know. I mean, that's my optimistic take on it.
And one of my worries resonates with one of the things that you said, which is I have this worry that if we keep feeding AI with AI generated content, because there will be more and more AI generated content, it will spiral down in quality. I think it will worsen over time. So I fully agree with you that maybe the best gift that AI brings to creative people is just this push outside of your comfort zone to push you to just explore the weirdest ideas that you have so that you can differentiate from that average content.
And I do think that one of the things, like in Steal Like an Artist, that's interesting is I recommend that people swim upstream. That, like, for example, if you love a band, one of the ways that you grow as an artist is to not just listen to that band and any band they influence, is to swim upstream, listen to what they listen to, and to go up to that kind of source. And another thing that happens for an artist is we don't honor this enough, but one of the things that makes an artist is what they haven't been exposed to. The holes in your experience can be very, very powerful. Like if you grew up only looking at one kind of art and you didn't see what everybody else saw, then you have this like unique perspective. And I think a lot about in the future, whether a young artist who, for example, went to video stores or like garage sales and found all this weird stuff that was like on a VHS tape instead of what they could see on Netflix. I always wonder if like that's the kind of person we'll see in the future, is making like really weird, interesting stuff, is the people who are, if you want to use the AI metaphor, train themselves on this more esoteric, like weird stuff versus what was mainstream, But that's always kind of been true.
I think so. And look, that gives me a good segue to something that I wanted to discuss with you, because if I were to start this conversation at some point of your book, I would probably start on the very first page on the dedication that reads to Boom, whenever Boom gets here. Because I think parenting has been a big part of your journey since you published this book. I believe you have 2 children, if I'm not mistaken.
I have 2 boys,
My daughter is 7 months old now, so we are very early in the game of parenting. But I've come across some of your thoughts about it, and it seems to me that you are passionate about the topic. So I would love to ask you, how has raising your children impacted your creative work, and what have you learned from them?
Well, that's a great question. So my career Megan, my wife, was pregnant with our oldest, Boom, who's Owen. That's our oldest. She was pregnant with him when I did the Steal Like an Artist. And Steal Like an Artist came out when she was Oh, not that far along.
Okay.
And so the books and the kids kind of came at the same time for me. Um, I have had the pleasure of being home a lot for there
Yeah.
because this is what I'm here. This is behind our house, and
Hmm.
I've been around them a lot. And it's so interesting because people have asked me over the years, when are you going to write a parenting book? When are you going to write a book about you and your kids? And I have finally gotten to a place where I think I can write about them,
Okay.
but it's not the book that I think anyone actually wants. And this is what I have discovered in my journey. Having children around, children are born artists, they're born scientists, they are extremely tapped into the universe. Everything is new to them, everything is
Hmm.
psychedelic and interesting and wonderful. And for the first 5, 6, 7 years, depending on how long you can get them to stay in that raw state, they are remarkably naturally creative
Hmm.
beings. And so my primary advice to parents in the early days is to leave them alone and follow their lead, as far as, because people say, "Oh, how do you make your kids more creative?" And it's like, so the book I'm trying to work on right now is how being around young kids can give us
Hmm.
a second breath of creative, a second wave of creative juice, because
Hmm.
I have found that being around my children has helped me think about the things that really turned me on when I was their age. And so, one of the things I'm trying to do in the next book is to try to kind of bottle that energy, to kind of like put that, like, put all that energy in a book
Hmm.
and save it for later, and for all the readers, because I really feel that if you're creatively frustrated as an adult, if you spent a day or two with a 4-year-old, I think it does something really magical to your experience. Now, it can also take you away from your work, of course, because
Hmm.
babies, are very hard, and young children are very hard, and they require a lot of attention and stuff. But once you kind of get them here, and they it can be a kind of second creative life for you, and
Hmm.
that's what it's been for me. It's really, it's brought me to, play. I think is something, I'm much more playful in my work after having children. They really, connected me with that playful spirit. I try constantly to, kids sort of have what artists want, which are fresh eyes. Kids
Hmm.
have eyes that haven't been murked up, haven't been blurred by convention or,
Hmm.
definition or anything like that. So they really have a raw power of seeing. And they're also, my kids were extremely literal. They took things very literally. And I'm trying to think of an example, but they say these beautiful poetic things because they really take everything at face value. So they'll say, like, I don't know, and then they'll say really mystical things. Like, one time we were sitting around a campfire, and my son Jules said, "The fire looks like it's trying to tell us a story." And I just thought, so like, so one of my projects as a parent has been to kind of try to capture these moments and try to,
That's
like,
beautiful.
for myself. But then what I'm trying to do now is try to transfer that
Hmm.
experience into a book that can benefit everyone, because
Hmm.
I really want to, there are people with kids and there are people without kids, but I
Hmm.
think everyone can really benefit the same way everyone can benefit from having older people in their lives. Um, I think everyone could benefit from having this kind of childlike wonder in their life. And so my project right now is to try to bottle this, to try to, like, put it in a book form, like Steal Like an Artist, to steal their energy because I'm so tired and I don't have any myself anymore, is to try to, like, take this vampire out these kids and put it in a book. And my dream is that one day when they're my age, maybe they might pick up the book and say, oh, this is who we were to dad, or oh, this. So I have this project in my head, and
That's
it's taken
beautiful.
me, years, and it's taken me half of a decade to even figure out how to do it. But I would say that for me, to answer that was a long-winded way to answer your question, which is my kids have taught me. I've learned incredible things from them. I doubt there's no way that they've learned as much from me as I've learned from them. So it's been a remarkable thing. Now, that said, I'm very lucky that my wife is a full-time mom, and
Yeah.
she's really I have a little bit less of the domestic hard work that it takes to
Right.
raise kids, so I've gotten all the benefits and fewer of the downsides.
Mm.
But I'm extremely, I've spent a lot of time in the past half decade reading memoirs by mothers who are artists, and really being inspired by artists whose children really were like a second wind to them.
Mm. Mm.
Because uh, there's a terrible phrase by an American writer named Cyril Connolly, and he says that the enemy of great art is the stroller. and and for me it was the opposite. I mean, I felt like my kids sort of gave me permission to go back to that early passion that made me want to make things and do what I do in the first place. So it's been a marvelous time. Not that it's been easy, but it's been
Yeah, I imagine. I
marvelous.
imagine.
Yeah,
I only have 7 months of experience, but it's obviously hard. But it's at the same time, it's really fascinating how a small child or a toddler looks at the simplest thing with absolute fascination and trying to
absolutely.
understand how the world is, what the world is made of, and how things work, and how they look at things with complete dedication to every angle, and trying to figure out what everything is. That it's just perplexing.
And you've
Um,
also described an artist. That's what an artist is
yeah,
supposed to do.
yeah,
They're supposed to look at very simple things
yeah.
and turn it and say, look at how weird this is. And if they're good artists, they can give us that. They can make the best artists make us look at our everyday life
Like a
as
Campbell soup, for
as
instance.
if it was strange, right?
Yeah,
As if this
yeah,
was an alien planet. And
yeah.
but that's what kids do, which is so wonderful if you're not so stressed out and tired that you
Of
could
course.
spend some time with
And one
it.
thing that I think it's funny about the upbringing of children is that how sometimes the smallest things in our upbringing can shape who we become, right?
Sure.
I am an engineer, but I was raised by artists. My
Hmm.
dad was a painter, and my mother is a creative spirit and has experimented with writing and photography her whole life. And I think I picked up from them some of the curiosity and the passion to create, even if I applied it in a very different way. And researching for this interview, I heard a few things that your parents told you that eventually found its way to your books, even if it wasn't necessarily creative advice, right? What are the main lessons that you think you picked up from your parents about how to be creative, or how to be a creative person?
Well, so the great blessing of childhood for me was I got to see my parents do things with their hands.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up outside of a small town in the country, so I grew up in the
Mm-hmm.
middle of a cornfield, really. And my mom was a home ec teacher, and then she became a educational administrator. But she was a teacher, and she
Mm-hmm.
taught people to cook and to
Mm-hmm.
sew and to really make a home. This is back when, you know, they still taught those kinds of things in school.
Yeah.
So when I was growing up, I watched my mom sew, I watched my mom cook and bake, and she was always into crafting and took me
Mm-hmm.
to like craft. I remember going to craft shows when I was younger. She's very into fashion and, took me shopping all the time. So and then on the other side of that, my dad later on, I didn't get to see my dad be as creative when I was younger because he was working all the time. And, but I did see him like work on the car and stuff like that. But then when when we got a little bit older, my dad, sort of bought this piece of property and kind of transformed it into this beautiful kind of horse ranch, like this little horse ranch. And watching him kind of start, I only realized later in life that I have watched someone take nothing and turn it into something. You know, I've watched a parent do that. And so I think that is the great, and I think one of the reasons my books are very inclusive, that they reach out to people, is because I've really experienced creativity from people who would never call themselves artists, or really would have any real interest in art with a big capital A. So it's so that's really what my parents gave me. Now my mom, you know, they were both educated people. And so, you know, I always got the message that learning was important. But yeah, that was the real gift, I think, in hindsight, is to be around parents who really did things with their hands. That was a remarkable gift.
And I think it was a remarkable gift in two ways, because it's not only seeing people doing creative things, but also without some of the bullshit that comes in from the artistic world sometimes, right? Because something that bothered me from the artistic circles that my parents were part of was this sort of distinction that people did between pure innate talent and the type of technical mastery that comes from hard work in learning a craft.
Right.
So it seemed to me that the innate talent was admired, while the technical mastery was kind of looked down on. And you've written a beautiful trilogy on creativity, because we've spoken a lot about Still Like an Artist, but you wrote as well Show Your Work and Keep Going. And I think that trilogy points in the direction of how one thing reinforces the other, how the day-to-day work and inspiration reinforces whatever talent anyone has. So what are your thoughts on actually developing creativity? To what extent can someone learn to be creative? Or I would maybe rephrase it and express their inner creativity, because I do think that people are creative by nature.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I have become increasingly interested in is the world around, is thinking of, in Show Your Work, my book, I talk about this idea of genius, which is kind of what you were saying, is like the superhumanly talented person who just has it naturally. And, you know, but then Brian Eno, the musician's idea of genius, which is that great work and great art, these great geniuses that you usually think of, they're often located in this thing called a genius, which is this whole group of people who are stealing and sharing from each other. You think of someone like even someone like the great Spaniard. Let's just take Picasso or something. Picasso is superhumanly talented, sure, but he's born to like a dad who's an art teacher, knows what to do with him. He's got his little crew. He ends up in Paris. He's around all these other artists and stuff. So you can retell Picasso's story as less of one as just this superhumanly talented guy than this really talented guy that finds himself in the right environment, right? And so what I would really like people to take from my work is that you might not be the person in the middle, but you might be the person over here on the side who has a rich life creating this whole scene, right? Or playing a role in this scene. And that's something, as someone who I consider my talents to be very modest, what I have been very good at, I think, is creating a network around myself where I point to great work out in the world and I kind of bring it into, and I share it with other people. So I feel that a great big portion of my work is not me. It's not me saying, hey, look at what I've made. It's me pointing out at the world and saying, this is good. This is good. I love this. Have you thought about this? Have you seen this? And being that kind of person who is really sharing. And in the act of sharing, I've made these connections. It's kind of made this, scenius for my readers in a sense. And so what I'd really like, especially young people, to know is
Hmm.
that you can be a part of our collective creativity. Even if you don't feel
Hmm.
like you have your own, collectively, you can become part of a creative world. Whatever world you want to
Hmm.
join, you can be in that world. And then you match up your natural talents to one of the things I love to tell people is that you look at the world you want to join, and then you find the little holes where
Hmm.
people aren't doing the work you want to do. And to have a great career or a great life is to find one of those holes where you say, I think I could fill that with my own
Exactly.
stuff. Or I think I could take these people and connect them in that way, and just to just get people to think that it's not just about the stuff that you kind of reach down in your skull and pull out.
Hmm.
It's about connecting things, connecting
And
things out in the world to make new discoveries.
yeah, and there are also several ways of arriving to great work, right? We always think of this creative genius, and maybe Picasso is a good example, as someone that's able to paint whatever he wants very easily and very fast. And then I heard once a great podcast episode by Malcolm Gladwell, in which he explored the history of the song. Alleluia from Leonard Cohen
Yeah.
that took like
Yep.
15 years in
Right.
the making, right? And
Yep.
he compared Picasso to Cézanne. And
Uh-huh.
Cézanne was the complete opposite. He did like
Yep.
15 versions of every painting because he was more of an incremental artist, right? So I
Yep.
think also people get too obsessed about the idea of having that talent instead of just finding ways of getting to where you want to go with your work. And
Yes.
it, as you said, it's just finding what's the hole in the seam that you can fit, that you can fill in with your talent or your ability, right?
Yeah.
Um, and look, another one of my favorite books on creativity, I think is The Creative Habit by Twyla
Oh
Tharp.
yeah.
I love how
Sure.
she puts the structure and routine at the service of creativity, how she, in a sense, in a good sense, industrializes the process while
Yeah.
leaving room for the ideas to be born and for the connections to be found.
Well,
How do you think about habits? What are your recommendations when it comes to having a process?
I think it's interesting how like Andy Warhol called his studio the factory.
Yes.
And Warhol like kind of he talked all the time about how he wanted to be a machine. And really, the more you find out about Warhol, the more he was not a machine, and he used his hand is in everything. And but the thing I like about Twyla Tharp's work and this idea of habit is having a creative routine. People think, oh, I'm an artist. I need to be free. I need to be like, oh, I can't be like chained down to a routine. And for some people, they can't. But for a lot of us, the world is very distracting and
Hmm.
it will always pull you away from your work. And so the beauty of having a routine is it's something solid and stable that you can go to, and then you can be as wild as you want while you're doing the work.
Hmm.
And another way to put it is it's the constraints that give us the freedom to work. Because
Mm-hmm.
if you don't, one of my friends, Beth Pickens, she talks about how creative people, when they don't practice, they suffer. If you don't
Hmm.
go, one of the ways you can know that you're an artist or a creative person is that if you spend 4 or 5 days without working and you feel bad, that's a hint. Like if you
Hmm.
feel bad inside, that not guilt that you haven't worked or anything like that, you just really feel bad because you haven't been able to practice. That means you're a creative person. And
Hmm.
one of the things the schedule does is, or a routine, is that it gets you to work. It gets
Hmm.
you as far as getting into the place. And then you can practice.
Hmm.
You could do your practice, and it's spiritually refreshing. I always I'm not necessarily the most religious person, but I find great. Um, I find that the artist in some ways has to become devout in a sense.
Hmm.
An artist has to dedicate
Hmm.
themselves to the work in the same way that a monk might dedicate
Hmm.
themselves to God. And one of the I was reading about some nuns one time, and these nuns said, we don't pray because we have problems. We pray because the bell rings. So they had this bell in the monastery, and the bell rings. And they said, we pray because the bell rang. It's that kind of that return, that practice, right? That devotion.
Yeah.
And if you can
Yeah.
cultivate that in your own life, I mean, I just really believe in the power of, if you go to the same place at the same time for this, every day, you'll be surprised what happens.
Exactly.
And that's always my like first, piece of advice for people is like, just try going to the same place for the same time with the same materials, this same time, space, and materials every day for a month. See how it changes you. But
Yeah.
that's also, I know a writer named Mary Carr, and she says, why don't you try praying for 30 days and see if your life gets better? It's this idea of devoting yourself to something. Because we're
Yeah.
ancient, we're not that advanced. That's the thing with like all of the computers and AI and stuff. We're really not that advanced. We still really respond to some of these ancient human practices, this idea of devotion, this idea of habit. It's funny, they call a
Yeah.
nun, what a nun wears in English is
Yes.
called a habit.
A bit.
So,
Yeah.
it's this, and there is this sense of, I think Twyla Tharp talks about this, there's this sense of ritual when you get in
Yeah.
the studio where even if you can put on like a dopey sweater, like, or there's
Yeah.
like a shirt you wear or a hat you put on when you start working, there is something about that transformation, and then you can get to play. You get to work, I guess.
It kind of reinforces the power of the habit, right? Because the actual ritual puts you in the mindset and just kickstarts the process in a way. The more times you've done it, the more times that connection works, I would imagine.
Yeah, and you have to be ready for nothing to happen. I mean, that's what's
Exactly.
really hard for people, I think, is to know that, like, I tell people all the time, I'm like, for there will be days where I'll sit down to do a poem every day, and you know 9 days nothing happens and it's all
Mm,
trash, and then maybe on the 10th day there's like something worth saving.
yeah.
That's a pretty good hit rate, actually.
Yeah.
Like, because like if I could get, I always think, if you get one sentence you can save in a week,
Yeah.
it's just, but I always tell people like Stephen King, the American writer,
Yes.
it's like, the way he puts it is like, if I can get one page a day, at the
Exactly.
end of the year, I've got 365 pages. That's it. Like, if you can just do one page a day, those days add up. And I think that's another great,
Perfect.
that comes up in my books over and over again, is this idea that these little bits and pieces of effort, they pile up, and eventually
Perfect.
you have a body of work.
Exactly. Exactly. You've mentioned one of my obsessions for creativity, which is constraints.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have ever watched a movie that's called Buried. It was a very small hit in the US. The lead and really only actor was Ryan Reynolds, and it's
Yes.
one guy in a casket, right?
Yep. Yep.
So the director is a Spanish guy, is Rodrigo Cortés, and I've heard him talk several times about how constraints can help creativity.
Yeah.
Because a blank page can be intimidating, but it can also force you. It can also force you to. But having constraints can force you to work with those constraints, right? Forcing yourself to shoot a movie with just one actor in a box is a
Yep.
challenge waiting to be accepted. So, what do you think the role of constraints should be when trying to be creative?
I think they're imperative. I mean, I think they're so helpful to me that I really, I like things that are really tight, that you can only like, I have to be careful I have to be careful that I don't have too many because I like a lot
Mm,
of them. And my favorite art is based on constraint. I mean, it's someone trying to, but there are different kinds of constraint, right? So there's time constraint. There's like, let's see what we can do in 15 minutes fast.
mm,
There's space constraint. What can we do on the bus, to work? There's material constraint. There's what can we do with the pen and paper? What can we do with, can we make a collage with no scissors? That kind of thing. Can I make some, so it's like there's different kinds of constraint. But I would say that you need at least, something needs to be constrained in order for that. You have to have something to rub up against. Like there has to be a little bit of friction. I'll try to be, there has to be, with an oyster.
You need to find solutions in a way, right? You need to find solutions to where you want to get.
There needs to be kind of a problem, something you're pushing against. I always think of it like I ride bicycles. And I love riding. And one of the things that I'm always thinking about is friction. If you have too much friction, the bicycle doesn't move and you can't go anywhere. But if there's no friction, you also won't go anywhere.
Exactly.
Right? The wheels will spin. So there's like a proper friction. And that's also true in our creative work. We have to find the proper friction. And like a guitar player this is a very easy example. A musician needs to find an instrument that is just it's just easy enough and just hard enough to play. It's like Jack White is really of the White Stripes is really good on this. He talks about how he likes guitars that are hard to play because he feels like he really has to wrestle with them and get the right sound and that kind of thing. So for some reason, I always find it's easier to think about like music for me because I'm kind of I'm a hobbyist. I'm a musician. That's what I did with my younger years and what I still really love. But like haiku, I think is a great example.
Definitely.
That's something where everyone can write a haiku, technically. It's very, but to be able to write a good one takes a long, long time, right? To really get into it and have that thing. So I always think that, constraint is everything for me. It really is. And to the extent that when I'm working on a book, it really helps me to know what the trim size is. One of the reasons I like doing those square books is that I'm like, okay, a square, I know what that is. I know what I can do with that, And for this next book, it's kind of funny. I thought maybe the trilogy was over, but I got to thinking about it and I was like, I just really like the square format. And there's something about it that makes it very easy for me because I can work with that. It gives me the right constraint, And so to find those constraints I think it's imperative for the work. And one of the things that's really interesting is that the constraint you put on your work now, you might need a new one later because eventually you'll figure out, I know how to work. Like you pick up an old guitar that is hard to play and you get some good songs out of it, but pretty soon you figure it out and it's time. And then you might have to find another guitar or another instrument or so it's a constantly evolving. That's another thing that I think creative people need to get really ready for. And parents too. This is a great lesson for parents is that you have to be constantly evolving.
Exactly.
If you're not, the minute you think you have anything figured out, that's a very dangerous place to be because the minute you think you have something figured out as a parent or an artist, that's a very dangerous zone. And the best thing that can happen to you is some moment of chaos that throws you out of that and you continue. But the worst thing I think that could happen to an artist in a lot of ways is to feel like they've figured out how to do what they're doing. You see that?
Sorry, I was going to say, I think that's the worst thing that can happen almost to everyone, right?
Yes.
Not only to an artist. And that leads me to something that I wanted to discuss with you, because I think most of your work is about creativity, but in all of your books, I've found ideas and lessons that I think are much more universal. Like what we just discussed, I think it's applicable not only to creativity and artists, but beyond that, for a lot of people trying to find purpose in life, it's also a constant work of evolving and feeling that they haven't fully figured out how life is, right? And I think one of those things or more universal truths that I found in your books is obviously your take on authenticity. This notion of stealing to discover your own voice or style that I feel applies beyond the creative work. I think we all seem to be obsessed with being original and authentic, and I think we forget that at the end we are just a mix of bits and pieces from a lot of people, with obviously our own weird mix of that, and we are authentic in that way. What do you think are the actual keys to authenticity? Obviously in creative work, but also in life.
I think the key is really I think, and this is just as where I am in my thing, is to really, really identify with the things that you're stealing from. To find things that you feel like I could have made this, or this is what speaks to the stuff that really makes your gut strings vibrate. Mm-hmm. To really have the I think authenticity, you take that word, it's about authority. It's about having the sense of self that you are enough and that you are worthy of your outlook. And what I mean by that is that you can trust yourself. You can trust your taste. And so this takes a lot of courage, because if everyone, you see what happens if, for example, if you are drawn to this thing that not that many people are drawn to, you might say to yourself, well, maybe I'm broken. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe I just don't get it. Maybe I should be into comic book movies, or, whatever it is. You have to have the bravery, the kind of courage to really love what you love, and to really to make, the things that are setting off all of your sensory, systems, to really grab that stuff and love it, and not to be ashamed, and not to be, not to worry about whether it's right or not. I think like Quentin Tarantino as a filmmaker is a great example of that. He's really let himself, in the beginning, he really let himself love things that maybe other people thought were trash, or thought were, beneath them, or that kind of thing. I think every artist has to kind of discover. The thing about influence is that it activates something in us. Like great work activates something inside of us. It brings us to our own juices, or whatever it is. Great creative work unlocks our own creative work. And that's why you'll hear from a lot of artists, they'll say, I went to see this person and I thought they gave me the permission. I thought, that's what I want to do. I can do that, and that is the most powerful thing in an artist's young life. But I think that's what's inauthentic, is trying to love what other people love, trying to love what the market loves, trying to just be the average, like the computer, right? Like, oh, I'll just I'll do the average of what people, oh, well, this is what a podcast is. A podcast has to be like this, and that's how you get listeners, and that kind of thing. I do it, it happens to me all the time with my newsletter. If I start thinking well, what is everyone else doing with a newsletter, that I get away from myself. But when I start asking myself, what do I love in a newsletter? What do I really love when I pick up a book? What do I really love when I look at a work of art? If I keep that in the back of my mind, then I say, then you do that thing, and it's just a confidence thing. It's an authority thing. It's feeling worthy. There were a lot of years that I don't think I necessarily felt worthy of, what had happened to me, or what, I had, the books being, I don't know. Success is a very hard thing to deal with. Because you usually become successful because you got something that people didn't know they were looking for, or they, you went by the seat of your pants, as we say, or you just threw everything you had at something and it hit. And sometimes when that happens, then you try to reverse engineer it. or you start saying, okay, this is what people like about me, I'll do more of that. And that's like an artistic dead end. You have to really think, well, what have I got? What do I
Yeah.
have? And you got to keep flinging that out, and like, that's how you have to go forward. And I'm not an authority on this subject. Like, I've had to learn this the real hard way in my work, but it's this constant churn,
Yeah.
and burn.
Yeah, you were mentioning for a second success, and with success and obviously with exposure comes criticism, which is another thing that I've heard you speak about, and I think it's extremely important in life, is dealing with criticism and even seeking it out. There are quite a few ideas about it across your books, some of which I think resonate a lot with another great book, The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield.
Mm-hmm.
What have you learned are your keys to keeping a healthy relationship with criticism?
Well, one of the keys for me is that criticism is great at telling you what you've done wrong. It's terrible at telling you what you should do next.
Mm-hmm.
So don't ever try to, unless you say, I'm going to do the only thing I've ever seen is Jean Cocteau one time he said, whatever the critics hated in my work, I said, I'm going to do more of that. That was the only like healthy thing I ever saw. And I don't even know how healthy it is because it's still reactive. I think the thing for me that's really important is to understand that criticism is autobiographical, that where the source is coming from. I just read a really great interview with it was Sidney Lumet, who made some great movies in the 70s, and there was a very famous American critic named Pauline Kael, and she was a big fan of his in the beginning, but then she sort of had a vision for where his movies should go, and he wasn't going there, and so she started giving him these really terrible reviews, and he had to kind of like, he said very clearly, I don't make movies for Pauline Kael, but he could have easily he could have said, well, maybe Pauline's right, so it's like, you just can't really make the work for anybody else. It's really hard, it's just really hard, but
Sidney Lumet did one of my favorite movies in the 70s, which is Network, which is an amazing movie. And in a sense, it speaks to that, right? It speaks to what happens when you give the audience what the audience seems to want, and it gets really nasty really fast.
That's true. That is really true. And he wrote a great book, by the way, called Making Movies. I
didn't know.
One of my favorite pictures of me, we were talking about parenting earlier. I have a picture of me with my youngest in my arm in a chair, and I've got Making Movies in the other hand. And that's my other piece of advice for people who have young kids, is to find the one-armed miniature version of what you do. What can you do with like one? Is there something you can do with one hand? For most parents, it's like, I'll look at my phone.
Look, before we finish, we're about to finish, but I could think of a few others, but maybe the last of those universal ideas that I wanted to explore with you is this notion of the ordinary plus the extra attention equals the extraordinary from your book, Keep Going. I love it because it relates to one of my personal obsessions, which is the different levels of both enjoyment and insight that one can have when seeing someone else's work. As I said, my father was a painter, and when we went together to museums, I could tell that we were experiencing the paintings on different levels, right? He had, we both had we both simply could enjoy the experience of looking at it, whatever it made us feel, but he had a deeper understanding of the more technical aspects, or he could even try to analyze the choices that the artist made when creating it. So maybe two questions in one. First, how do you think we can develop this attitude of paying closer attention to the ordinary? Mm-hmm. And second, when you're in front of an artwork, whether it's a book or a painting or a piece of music, what layers do you try to peel back and understand from your creative perspective?
Okay, so let's take the first one.
Yes.
My friend Rob Walker has written a great book called The Art of Noticing. And
Hmm.
Rob gives these very practical assignments that kind of can estrange the world enough that you pay
Hmm.
certain kinds of attention to it. So like one of my favorite things that he recommends is like take a walk in your neighborhood and pay attention to everything blue that you see or anything orange or
Hmm.
purple or pick a color and then
Hmm.
pay attention to everything you see. And all of a sudden you're looking for something you'd be amazed once you start looking for things how you
Hmm.
see it everywhere, or the meaning that comes out of all the red things you see on your walk. All of a sudden those things start talking to each other and
Hmm.
they give you weird ideas. So I think one thing is to give yourself little assignments to trick yourself into looking.
Hmm.
The example I used in Keep Going was one of my heroes, Karita Kent, would give like kids this little viewfinder, like an index card, and she'd
Hmm.
have them kind of crop the world as if they were about to take a photograph, and just having to look through the world just like this is it changes the way you're
Of
in the
course.
world and what you pay attention to. So that's like one thing. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to pay a different kind of attention, not
Hmm.
your kind of ambient I'm in my head, but you're really trying to really focus on things you wouldn't necessarily focus on.
Hmm.
Drawing is another way. When you
Yes.
have to draw something, you really have to look at it. I don't think a lot of people get that. They think drawing is a talent for making marks. It's actually more of a talent of being able to see and see things very
Hmm.
clearly what they are. So that brings me to my next thing. When I'm looking at a piece of art, I am
Hmm.
obsessed with when I'm taking art in, I'm obsessed with time and repetition. So
Hmm.
I think your average person does not spend enough time with
Hmm.
things. It's very rare to get a person to read a book. It's even rarer to get a person to reread a book, because it's really on the rereading. Like I know that Don Quixote is a book that I'm going to read again. It's probably going to be
Hmm.
10 years from now, but
Yeah.
I'm going to read it again and it's going to take on another layer when I read it. Um, we kind of know this with music or movies. Like we'll watch our favorite movie over and over again and we'll
Yes.
always see something new. Or we'll listen to a piece of music over and over and it'll become like one day we'll put it on and we'll hear something we never heard before.
Yeah.
We kind of know that. To try to pay that kind of attention to other stuff, to a painting hanging in a museum or something like that,
Yeah.
to just like spend time. The other thing I think is really important, like when you go to museums, um, don't read the labels in a museum. The first thing to do is to go through the museum and try to look at the artwork without looking at the labels. Try to pick out. One of my favorite things I've ever done is I got to teach these kids one afternoon at the Dallas Museum of Art. I got to tell them how I look at art,
Ah,
and
nice.
these kids were like, I don't think an adult had ever said this to him. I said, "Yeah, I don't even look at the labels. Let's stand in the room here and you look around, you say, "Well, what's that?" And you go to that and you look at it. And you look at it and I said, "You need to look at it back here." And then okay, then you need to get really close to it. And
Hmm.
then and we did this thing and I just don't think anyone had ever told them, you go to a museum and whatever speaks to you, you go right to that thing and you look at it for a while, and then once you're done looking at it, then you can look at the label. Just
Hmm.
like weird stuff like that. But it's really just about, again, giving yourself permission to be like, I have an internal meter on what's good or what
Hmm.
I can use or what's interesting to me. And I don't need to know what the famous painting is in here that I should be looking at and why it's great. I need to find the thing that I think is interesting and spend more time than I probably should with it, right? And that's when you'll kind of unlock the thing that
Yeah.
that's when you find the kind of things you need, you know.
Yeah. It's
And
it's
yeah.
also sorry. It's also in a way how a children would naturally behave, right?
It, you bingo. One of the things I did when I was one of the things I did with my kids when we went to the art museum is I'd let them just go. I'd say find something you like and tell me about it.
Yeah.
And we do that. And half the time it would be something that wasn't a painting. I mean, this is the amazing thing about kids. I have these wonderful pictures of my kids down on the floor looking at the exit sign, the neon exit sign on the floor. And I just thought, this is
That's
amazing.
wonderful.
I mean, again, this is what we want. This is what going to a museum should do for us. We should say, yes. Like and you can get in this kind of ecstatic state if you're at a museum long enough, or if you're someone like me and you're at a museum long enough, everything becomes like very weird and strange and you get kind of delirious. I remember one time I was at the Chicago Museum of Art and I said, wow, this paint, what is this? Boy, this is really weird thing. It was this like, it looked like some ancient machine with a bunch of buttons and had this big thing running up to the ceiling. I was like, holy crap, what is this? And I turned to, it didn't have a label. And I turned to the museum guard. I said, excuse me, ma'am, what is this? And she said, she was chewing gum. She said, that keeps the paintings from melting. And it was the air conditioner. But that's like, I was in the zone. Yes, look at this strange, amazing thing. And I still think about that all the time. But yes, this is why I say you should have a 5-year-old docent when you go to the museum, because you should have a 5-year-old tour guide, because they don't care at all what is, and they provide these wonderful, another time I took my son to a sculpture garden. And it was great. We were looking at sculptures, but then he ended up at the gate looking at all the cars zooming by. And I was like, yeah, this is a typical kid thing. But then I thought to myself, well, what is a car but a moving sculpture? I mean, that's what a car is. So all of a sudden it's like, boom, but this kind of magical thing that happens, this really is what art and literature and everything creative that we do, it's supposed to make life more interesting, right? It's supposed to make us want to get out of bed in the morning and see what's in the world. It's literally supposed to just make us see the world differently,
That's beautiful. I fully agree. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of this interview that I'm enjoying really, really a lot. But there is one question that it's almost compulsory in this podcast. My mission with this project is to help myself, but also others, to understand the world a little bit better every day. So I will always ask my guests the same question, which is, what 3 books or movies or documentaries or video games or any other piece of content have helped you understand the world better or shaped your view of the world? 3 that come to mind.
That is a tall order. I'll try to do multimedia things.
Sure.
I'll try. So let's take a book. I would say there is a woman named Linda Berry, and her name appears in several of my books. She has a book called What It Is, and she has several other books. She's kind of like my hero. A lot of the stuff that you hear is me filtering Linda, or she's just kind of like she's a real like North Star guiding light for me. She's been hugely inspirational for me. I met her when I was 22, I think, or something like that, and she just became my favorite artist. And she has a great Instagram, and her books are wonderful. Video games, I came to Zelda very late in life, and I have found that playing Zelda has some interesting, spending that much time in a video game. I've spent 100 hours in Breath of the Wild and 100 hours in Tears of the Kingdom, the sequel.
That's amazing.
And that kind of has rewired my brain weirdly. It's hugely escapist, but Zelda is interesting. But Zelda becomes interesting. I play video games in a very strange way. I listen to podcasts while I play Zelda.
Okay.
And so I might make a case for people, if you feel guilty about playing video games, which I do, listen to audiobooks or podcasts while you play, because the I'm very interested in the way different kinds of art can like chatter at each other at the
Yeah.
same time. So yesterday I was reading a thing about psychology, Jungian psychology, while I was playing Zelda, and Jung was talking about how dreams are the roots of thought in our day-to-day life. And I was if you've played Zelda, I was down
Yes.
in the depths of like underground, looking for these light roots that then are the shrines up above. So there's like the weird thing. So Zelda to me is like, I really
Yeah.
think that The Legend of Zelda, these two games are probably just my favorite art that's ever.
Yeah.
And it's weird because it's made by all these people, but I really find that the spirit of Zelda, there's just something about that open world that really speaks to me. So I would say play Zelda if you haven't. My kids hate Zelda, by the way. They're like, why would you play Zelda? They're Minecraft or Roblox. They don't.
Yeah.
They're very.
But
they think
those
Zelda's
are also
for.
open worlds, right? Those are also
Yeah,
open worlds.
yeah. And actually, my friends, they are my friends. My little gamers, they say, well, this Zelda is a ripoff of Minecraft. And I do think that the news, so they're critics when it comes to, but playing Zelda has been another thing. So let's talk about music. Cause music is really one of my passions. Let's see, what music would I write? Actually, here's something that I think instead of recommending a particular piece of music, I would recommend ways of listening to music.
Okay.
I think something that's happened to me, and this is true of authors too, I find that I'm usually brought to a musician by one song or one album, and I love that musician so much or that album so much that I don't explore. It's this strange thing that the brain does, but it's like I don't listen to the other stuff because I love this one thing so much. So something I've been giving myself as a task with artists and with artists, writers, and musicians is that if there's one piece of work that is like deeply speaks to me, to take the time to listen to the other stuff. So one of those bands for me is Depeche Mode. I didn't grow up with Depeche Mode, but Violator is one of my favorite albums. My art teacher used to play it in the drawing. That's the first time I heard it was in drawing class. And something about Violator makes me want to make stuff. Well, but I never really experienced the rest of Depeche Mode's catalog. Violator comes in the middle of their career. So I've been slowly making my way into their their discography. So I think my last thing that I would say to people is think about a book, an album, or a movie that you just can't get enough of. That's like, but you haven't seen the other stuff or you haven't listened to the other stuff. Give yourself a project and dig deep into an artist's work, because I think that is like something that's been very, very refreshing for me, and it gives me all I'm doing that right now with a band called Cocteau Twins. I love their album Heaven or Las Vegas, which I think is one of the great kind of dream pop albums, but I never bothered to listen to their other music, and it's all incredible. There's 10 hours worth of recorded music. So that would be my third thing that I made up.
That's really good, actually, because I think it's also a way of gaining greater appreciation for the thing you already like, right? Because you will understand it and put it in context. Austin, you've been extremely generous with time. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor talking to you today. I'll make sure to drop a few links in the description, but before we say goodbye, where's the best place for people to follow you? Perhaps your newsletter?
Yeah, I'm old fashioned. I still have a blog. I still have a website. So if you just type in austinkleon.com and you go there, there's links to all my books. And the thing that everyone seems to like of mine, even if they don't like my own work, is my weekly newsletter.
Awesome.
And I do that every Friday. It's free for everybody. So I think that's a really good way to like quickly figure out who I am and whether you might want anything to do with me, other than the books.
I'm sure people will. Thank you so much. It's been a great talk. Take care, Austin.
Super fun for me. Thank you very much for your time and for your wonderful questions.
And that's the end of the interview with Austin. I hope you liked it, and I would love to read your comments. Kaizen will be back next week with a different topic and in Spanish, as always. But until then, I encourage you to subscribe if you haven't already and to recommend it on your favorite podcast platform, on YouTube, on social media, or even better, to your friends. This way, you help me in keeping Kaizen growing. Also, if you enjoy the podcast, you can join the Kaizen community, a way to support it financially, which I greatly appreciate, but also to access a forum where you will find other curious minds, recommendations for hundreds of books and movies, exclusive content. You will also get ad-free episodes, mentoring sessions with me, and you will be able to attend our digital meetups. To do so, you just have to visit my website, JaimeRodríguezDeSantiago.com, and click on the red banner. Obviously, everything is in Spanish, so enter at your own risk if you don't speak the language. And from that very same website, or through my Twitter account, which you can see on the screen, you can send me your comments, suggestions, whatever you want. I always answer, although sometimes it may take me a bit. And that's all for today. As always, thank you very much for being there, and see you next time.